Big gap, so I will get started. The idea of this talk came to me a little while ago. I do quite a bit of work with the Ruby on Rails community, and if anyone follows them, you'll notice they had a kind of series of rather nasty vulnerabilities around the turn of the year, which would lead to code execution, applications being compromised. And there was quite a lot of kind of consternation and people thinking, what do I do about this? You know, people maybe who haven't dealt with security and stuff before, worrying about how do I react quickly to this? You know, I've got a running application. I can't just go and deploy patches to it because it might break things. And indeed, actually, this one did break things in a lot of people's applications when the patch came out. So this talk was really a little bit around convincing people that their framework is going to fail them. So that could be your it could be a security control, not necessarily a framework control, but things will fail you, and there are things you can do about that to try and make it less bad. So that's kind of this talk, make things less bad. The talk, I'm not going to talk about details of specific flaws. Really, there's a lot of people who already talked about those. A lot of security researchers have done great posts. If you're interested in the details, they were actually really interesting flaws. They were flaws basically where you pass text in as a parameter, and then because the way Ruby is very clever, it turned it into evaluated code and did bad things to the systems. So they were really kind of fun flaws to read about, but I won't kind of cover that today. What I am going to talk about, I want to talk about threats you might face, because I think that a lot of people they don't kind of maybe always think through all the threats they're going to face and how you can react to them, and then also some practical ways to improve security. So hopefully some of these will be relatively practical, relatively easy. I won't say, I mean, every speech today will probably mention the fact that in those security there are no silver bullets. This is no different. However, there's hopefully some that are easier to employ. And a bit about defense in depth. Security is something, you know, security people have been talking about defense in depth for forever. But I hopefully we'll be able to make that a bit kind of real and relevant. So the inevitable about me is just left it to me, so I shall. I've got this in here anyway. I've been in information security, security testing for some years. I used to put a number there, but it started depressing me because it got too high, so I took it out. And I'm the OWASP Scotland chapter here, so I've been running that now for about 4 years. We've got a kind of good group. If you have any colleagues or people you know in Edinburgh who would like to come along, we usually meet every 3 months or so. So your framework is going to fail you. That's the whole point of this talk. But why is that going to happen? Why is it going to fail you? Well, the first reason is OWASP. No, the first reason isn't actually OWASP. OWASP is not going to cause your framework to fail you. But what's on the OWASP symbol? It's a bug. So everyone who writes software knows software has got bugs, right? That's kind of inevitable. It's true. It always has been true, and it always will be true. So there's nothing really new there. But I think there actually is. If you look over the last couple of years, software bugs have gone from something which, security bugs anyway, which researchers might find, which internal staff might find, which testers might find, and now they're a commodity. So they're a commodity that's worth money. People will pay you good money for security bugs. If you're lucky, that's the vendor. So Facebook will pay you, Google will pay you, Microsoft will pay you for security bugs. That's great. On the other hand, other companies will pay you. So people like Zero Day Initiative will pay good money for 0 days. And at the far end of the spectrum, fairly obviously, cyber criminals will also pay for 0 days. And there's a well-established fact that there's now marketing bugs. So any time where you have a situation where you get paid money for something, guess what? People will go looking for it. If I can make $100,000 by finding a 0 day in a piece of software, that's a substantial amount of money. Depending on where I live, that could be several years' salary. So fairly obviously, I would suggest there can be far more security bugs getting discovered. If you're lucky, you'll get them in a nice way from a researcher who says, hey look, fun bug. If you're unlucky, you'll find out the hard way when someone exploits them. And the other thing actually from Tobias' talk, he was saying that, you know, developers don't very rarely write malicious. You unexpected. I actually think that what you might find in a couple of years' time, there's a real risk that you might actually find that someone might code a bug in deliberately because, say, they're not very happy in their job, and say they think, well, if I just let this one checkout on a piece of code, then actually that would be a security flaw, and I can sell that. And the interesting thing is you've seen governments buying these. So if you've ever seen, I mean, I'm going to avoid the use of cyber as much as possible. I can't really, I'm afraid, sometimes. Governments will talk about cyber weapons. So they want to buy cyber weapons. Well, a cyber weapon is just a bug and some malware to deliver it. So because governments buy these things, they're unlikely to crack down on the practice. You know, if I'm the US government and I want to buy these things for my US military cyber weapons program, I'm unlikely to try and stop people selling bugs. So I would suggest there's going to be a lot more security bugs going on, which is bad. And the other reason, there's not just bugs. I call this expectations gap. There's a big expectation. A lot of time when you see people writing code, and I'm a security tester by trade, so I test people's systems, and I tend to be essentially breaking their expectations. So I'm doing something they didn't expect. But in addition to that, you see missed expectations with regards to what security something can provide me. I mean, a good example of this is ASP.NET has a feature called request validation. Request validation essentially does some very basic checking for input to say, if I see a kind of angle bracket followed by a character, I'm going to assume it's cross-site scripting, and I'm going to block the input. The problem is that's not a perfect filter. And Microsoft will tell you that. Microsoft say this is not a perfect filter. However, I have done many .NET reviews where I find that as the one and only protection against cross-site scripting. And that's probably because the people writing the code thought we've got this request validation thing, and it's going to protect us. So there's a gap in their expectations against the actual what's provided. And Microsoft actually, I think, got really annoyed with this last year. And there's a bypass that came out like tail end of last year, and Microsoft didn't patch it and won't patch it. And I assume that they're doing this because they're so tired of being treated as a reason for people not to do input validation. They said, right, we're just not patching that one. And so it's great for me because now I used to be able to say, I think you're just using request validation, that's bad. Now I can say, hey look, cross-site scripting. So great for testers. But there's that kind of expectations gap. The other expectations, you might have expectations of your users that they won't do stupid things like put their passwords in 15 different sites. They will. That's inevitable. So there's an expectations gap there. And the last one is an expectation that technology is current. So people might expect that this software is all being developed with the current threat model in place. And we've talked before with the questions about legacy code. There's huge quantities of legacy code that was designed for an environment that looks nothing like the current threat environment. And therefore it's unlikely it's got the right kind of security controls in place. So more bad things happen. But why does it actually all that matter? Because here's the thing, if I get the buggiest, most security buggy piece of code in the world, if no one exploits it, it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. Most code with security bugs may run entirely properly through all its intended functions. So if no one tries to exploit them, I don't have a problem. Unfortunately, the internet is a dangerous place, and it's only getting more dangerous. Random noise. If you have a system exposed to the internet, you will be scanned. It is inevitable. If you look at logs from an SSH server, you will see the attempts. If you look at your web server logs, you will see people trying to find PHP-MyAdmin, or whatever the PHP, it tends to be PHP in my web server logs anyway. You tend to see people attempting to break into your system with automated tools. You basically have to account for this. The other interesting one is one of the things I was talking about, the Ruby on Rails bugs, which caused me to make this. Recently, I think it was last week, that actually got put into a bot, and people started scanning around in automatic fashion for any people who hadn't patched that vulnerability. And they were exploiting them and putting them into a part as part of an IRC bot. So they took what was quite a complex vulnerability and turned it into just something they just fired out, a couple of delete web servers and away you go. But you have to defend against this sort of stuff because it is inevitable you will be hit by it. Financial attackers. Right, it's fairly inarguable that people have worked out you can make money stealing things on the internet. If your software, the applications you manage, does anything even vaguely related to money, you might well be the victim of financial attackers. And these guys are quite different. These guys aren't like a random noise, because these guys are quite sophisticated, they're quite organized. If you saw, there was, I think it was, the latest one was last month, there was a series of Visa debit. They got like $25 million this time. They basically went around, broke into some systems, got prepaid debit cards, got all the guys to stand at cash machines, and then had access to the system that allowed them to refill the credit limit. So they just keep doing this, and they got like 25 million 24 hours. The funny thing is, that's not the first time that's happened. They started in 2008 or 2009 doing the exact same thing to prepaid Visa debit companies. So financial criminals, once they find something which works, kind of understandably, will keep doing it. So they just keep doing it, and you can go back. So basically, if you process anything and you see an attack on someone who's in your industry, who does financial services, expect they will come after you with the same attack. Because why not? If it worked last time, it'll work this time. There we go. Espionage. Espionage is kind of different. So it's a really broad heading. Espionage attackers will not be as noisy. Their goal is to get in, steal stuff, stay undetected as long as possible, and get out again. So they won't do, with the financial attackers, they know they'll get caught, because when all the money vanishes out of the system and Visa come for their payment, say, excuse me, can you pay up? They're going to, the breach will be detected. With espionage attackers, their goal is to try and not let you find them at all. So they will try and break in, do their stuff. And if you do anything with intellectual property, anything where the information you process is valuable to someone, then you really want to start thinking that people are going to use espionage attacks. And depending on the value, depends on what sort of attack they will use. But you see this could be horrible cyber war, which is really cyber espionage, which is governments trying to break into other people's systems, and obviously the ones in the press are all the Chinese ones that get publicized. I'm sure that's not the only ones there are, but they tend to get a lot of press. The recent example, I think, which is the best one, which was Kinetic North America. Remember that story? The story that went around was essentially they were compromised on and off for 5 years by a set of attackers, and they went right around every single system in their network and pulled all the intellectual property. You think about the value of the projects they're on. That's a pretty good return on investment for whoever did that. And the last one is hacktivists. They don't get so much press anymore because a lot of them got arrested and sent to jail. All the anonymous ones did. Anyway, that's kind of the ones who aren't so good. But there was a hacktivist story I thought was really interesting. Like, it wasn't really hacktivists in that kind of sense. It was some guys who broke into something called Linode. You may have heard of them. They're a large US-based provider of virtual private servers. So a company broke into them, broke into a lot of their systems, got a lot of passwords, and the reason they did it was to try and knock out one of their customers. Now, it wasn't some of the very high-profile software projects that hosted on Linode, like Nmap hosted on Linode, some of the large software tools hosted on Linode. That wasn't what they were after. They were after an IRC server for some people they didn't like. So they went to all the effort of taking out Linode. They also took out their DNS provider, name.com, a very large DNS provider, compromised them as well, purely and solely to get back at some people who had annoyed them. It's slightly worrying they were able to do that, because these are all systems that a lot of people rely on. People rely on DNS. The reason they broke into the DNS server was they realized that if they compromise DNS, they could just redirect all the traffic before it gets to your real server, proxy it, and grab all the credentials. So, you know, and I think that DNS providers are a real problem. I would really worry if I was one, because again, attackers have worked out this stuff works. If I can take out your DNS provider, I don't have to touch your systems. Just compromise your DNS, get all the traffic that was intended for you, and then maybe really out to you. Great, but hacktivists are kind of interesting because it's harder to predict you're going to get hit by them. So you could be a hosting company hosts something that's of interest. You could be someone who Anonymous don't like today, or Sony, you know, anyone, even Sony, they would probably didn't expect to have what happened to happen to them. But yeah, it can happen. So what can we do about all this? So I'm kind of making the point and the case here that what you can expect to see a lot more attacks. You expect to see more security bugs, and you can expect to see more people trying to exploit them. When I got this off Flickr, I didn't realize the name when I got it. I'm reliably informed this is a Smartie. So psychedelia, please don't, it's not something more dodgy than that. So I have this concept, I call most networks or most environments the warm Smartie effect. And the warm Smartie school of security is where you have a hard, crunchy outer shell, which stops people getting in, and once you're in, it's all soft and gooey. You can go pretty much anywhere you want. And unfortunately to say, I'm a security tester, and I still see this on a pretty much regular basis. You know, there'll be a firewall, but once you're past the firewall, it's pretty much a flat open network. And I'll be honest and say, if I do an internal job and I can't find at least one system that hasn't been patched, or at least one system that, you know, hasn't got a default credential, I'll be seriously shocked. Yet to happen to me. And I've been testing for quite some years. So at the moment, a lot of networks are like this, and I think that this paradigm has got to change. If you've got dedicated attackers, you've got stuff which is valuable to you, you've got to get rid of this, because otherwise, you know, they get in for there's a huge numbers of ways into networks these days. They're going to break in and they're going to start routing around your network, and you don't want to be a warm spot. Instead, you want to be one of these. The idea behind this, the system should stand alone. Each individual system should be a hard steel structure and should not be easily compromised. Because the problem is, instead of you relying on other people and that's compromised, that they can then go round. So the idea of trying to get something like this, the idea is trying to make it a bit more robust, a bit less likely to get broken. So a tale of two companies. So in all this, you know, I can talk about this, and a lot of security people are very guilty of this, is a lot of times they'll talk about this, oh, you need to do this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. That's fantastic, but not everyone's got the same amount of money. Not everyone's got the same amount of budget, not everyone's got the same amount of risk on the line. So really, you don't necessarily want to do the same things. So for the rest of this talk, I want to kind of do a tale of two companies. We've got a low risk, low budget, low risk. You know, you've got systems, you still have them out there, you still need to protect them, but you don't have a lot of money, and you're not really expecting the targeted attacks. So you're not really expecting that someone's going to spend a lot of money trying to compromise you. So low budget risk. And then high budget, high risk. So maybe you do have a lot of money on the line. Maybe you are expecting to be a target for activists, or espionage, or financial attackers. And the thing to think about, especially with espionage, is just because it may not be you that's got the information, it may be that you're a professional advisor. That's one that we are seeing a lot more of now. Professional advisors, law companies, accountancy companies, have got lots of sensitive information. And guess what? Attackers worked out. I don't need to go attack the main company, I can attack the advisor. Fantastic. So, but you're high budget, high risk. And what I want to do is kind of just to frame some of this, and I'm talking about more kind of network controls and various controls, is just use this as a kind of typical example. So this is a typical e-commerce setup, kind of small. We've got some load balancers, we've got some web servers, we've got some database servers. There's millions of these around the world for various different types of systems. We've got a nice firewall on the outside. This is, I hate to say this, typically how I'd say it. You've got one little firewall on the outside and we've got some servers. So I'm going to talk through all these, and I'm either going to run horribly over, in which case Justin will be very angry, or I will talk very quickly and I'll make it more time for questions. But I'm going to start at the bottom, because ultimately, that's where you have to start. You have to start with a network. There's no point in making the most fantastic system up the top. You've got lots of great application security controls if you sit it on top of an insecure network, because fundamentally it won't end well. And if you're in the low budget, low region, I would recommend looking into egress filtering. This is, again, I do security reviews, I do firewall reviews, and what I tend to see is you have your firewall, and you have your nice, your internet over here, and coming in the way, you have the rule of least privilege. So this is what way firewalls are meant to be. The idea is, anything which isn't explicitly allowed, I deny. And that's how firewalls are meant to be set up. So you have the smallest number of holes coming in. Usually that works on the way in. Unfortunately, on the way out, so traffic initiated from my internal servers, I tend to see in a lot of cases, they don't do that. They say, anything which isn't allowed, is we say I don't forbid, I just allow. And I've seen this quite commonly, because it's nice and easy, and it just works at that point. The downside is, and a lot of people say to me, well, why does that matter? You know, if this hacker's already compromised this system, why do I really care that much if he's going to make a connection out of the way? Well, the thing is, the very first thing an attacker will do, if they can execute code on your server, is they will try and download tools to do more bad things to your server. So they'll try and download a rootkit, they'll try and download additional hacking tools, or whatever it is they want to do. And if they can't establish a connection to their server, their life is more painful and more awkward, and it will slow them down. It might slow them down, it might actually stop them. If they really don't care much about your server, or if it's entirely automated, the bot will go, oh, failed to make a connection to my server, failed to download tools, move on to the next target, because I've got 500,000 targets to get through, and I'm in a hurry. So a bit of egress filtering, to be honest with you, it shouldn't be too hard to put in, depending on your environment. A lot of cases, you know, how many places does the load balancer need to initiate a connection to on the internet? Probably not that many. So in reality, you could probably filter that down quite nicely. If you're in a high budget, high risk world, I would thoroughly recommend, if you're not already doing it, segmenting your network. You need to chop things up, because as I said, once you get in, if I can compromise one system, you don't want to make it easy for me to go around and compromise all the other systems. So chopping up the network, even if it's something like this, a basic example. Load balancers don't need to talk on every port to the web servers. Web servers don't need to talk on every port to the database servers. So if you only have, for example, web server can only talk to the database server, the database port, I've gone from having maybe that's running like 20 services these days, you know, management services, various other things. I've gone from having 20 ports of attack to one port of attack. Made it 20 times, potentially 20 times more difficult for me to break through, to get further into the network. And the other thing, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, is it also is noisier, because realistically speaking, if you're a high-end attack, if you're a high-end, high-risk kind of company, you've got to expect someone's going to attack you probably successfully at some point. They're going to get, if there's not money, they'll buy a zero day. And they're going to break at least one control. And that's the kind of point of this whole talk. One control is going to fail. So you want to try and put them in a position where they're going to have to make noise. They're going to have to make a lot more noise, they're going to have to be a lot more active to get what they want, put a lot more effort into it. Sorry,
questions at the end, or?
No, go for now.
Get it, support it, and do know the consequences as well. You segment up your network, you bought yourself some nice IDS, intrusion detection appliances, and now you've got to buy separate ones for every zone.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for that. I think you're stuck with that, but I'm interested in your
absolutely. It's a good point. This is why I put this in my high-risk account. There's no question to me saying, don't expect to walk into a network that already exists especially to do this. Retrofitting firewalls is a pain, because you have to know every single traffic flow, otherwise you're going to miss something. And traffic flows may only happen once a month. So you've got patches only come down once a month. You block that port because you've done a bit of analysis and I don't need that. Bam. So really, for greenfield sites, do it at the start before you put stuff in, because it's much easier. But yeah, so that's, as you say, it introduces a lot more cost as well, not cheap. None of this stuff is free, I'm afraid. I'd love to say I had a great free security solution that helped everyone, but yeah, no. So, on to the next point, intrusion detection. Network intrusion detection is a really bad rep in security. I'm sure it was Gartner, someone actually said it was dead at one point. I personally don't agree with that. Excuse me. Network intrusion detection is it's a really straightforward concept. So essentially I have a set of rules, I look at traffic that goes past down my network, and I say, I don't like to look at that traffic, I'm going to alert. And to do network intrusion detection well, you have to spend a lot of money. You have to spend a lot of money tuning the rules. It's not so much buying the product, because there's open source stuff out there. But tuning the rules costs money, it's not free. But what I would say is, if you've not got a lot of money, consider just putting it on your network and leaving it there. And what it might be useful for is, if you have a breach, actually you can then say what they did. Because one of the big problems in breaches is, once someone's broken into your network, where did they go? What did they compromise? What software have they left on a server? Very hard questions to answer unless you've got intrusion detection and log monitoring. So, yeah, as a basic idea, if you've got load balancers, assuming you're terminating SSL here. Very importantly, some of the times I see people put IDS out, they put it on a segment that only sees SSL traffic. This is entirely pointless. Do not do that. So assuming you're turning SSL here, put a little IDS box and just have it listen. There's open source ones. You can get some of the security onion, which puts all the tools in a virtual machine. And you can install that and leave it sitting on your network. If you have a breach, come back and look at it, and it might tell you something really useful. It might tell you what they did. It might tell you when they turned up. It might tell you when they left. That's valuable information and probably doesn't cost a lot. And if you've got lots of money, look at network intrusion prevention. So the difference is, when I have my little rules engine and I see something I don't like, I'll actually block it. That's dangerous. And don't do it unless you know what you're doing, because the problem with blocking things is these things make mistakes. They will misclassify traffic. They don't have a lot of, if you think about where they are, they're down here at the bottom of the network. They don't have a lot of context about how your application works, so they will get things wrong. In IDS, that just means a false alarm, right? So if you're just sitting there and don't worry about it too much, then that's great, it's a false alarm, I don't have to worry about it. If this blocks your traffic and your application doesn't work, I guarantee you won't get turned off first, and it will be this. Because people think, yeah, so it sits actually in line of your traffic. And the other thing is that's another point of failure in your network. So I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you really want to and you're willing to invest the money in tuning it properly. Because untuned IDS is, you know, an application group that gets something their app break mysteriously when I can put it on, it's going to go away. So above this, if we step up the stack, we move up the way, then you inevitably hit servers. That's the inevitable next point. And we, at the low end budget, low end world, have another IDS, host intrusion detection. So you get free software for this. There's things like OSEC. OSEC's a free project. You can download it, install it. It will look at logs. It will look at checksums of files in your system, and it will alert you if they change or if something funny goes on. Again, if all you do is shove it on and have it send its alerts to an email box, even if you don't read them, valuable information if you have a compromise and you're trying to investigate. You're trying to work out what happened. These people will be able to tell you what went wrong. And hardening. Hardening servers is a great idea. Again, needs a bit of thought up front, not free, but get rid of the tools that hackers might use. So on a Linux box, the first thing that a hacker will probably use is curl or wget, depending on which way they like, to download tools. If those tools aren't on the box, they might have to work a bit harder. They might have to run some more commands. They might have to do something else which might turn up in the security log. So just make that work that little bit harder to do things. Actually, straight enough on Windows servers, if you can't turn off PowerShell, because PowerShell can do all the things wget curl can do and a wide variety of other things, but it's kind of hard to turn on. But yeah, if you can harden the server, turn off stuff, uninstall stuff that's not needed. The number of times I do a build review and there'll be something like an evaluation version of something that's expired. I'm thinking, why is that on a production server? Not a big plan. And could save you because it might make it hard again, make it life a bit harder. And yeah, this is acronym soup, so hopefully I'll explain them all. I'll do some blog posts. People can beat me up when I don't do them. I've done 3 so far. But yeah, I'll go through all the acronyms. Mac, only for high, but has anyone encountered has anyone used mandatory access control? I'm going to guess no. Okay, so the only place you will ever encounter these is in Red Hat-based distributions of Linux. They have a product called SE Linux, and the only way most people encounter it is to turn it off. I'd love to say that I wasn't in that group, but I am. So, but they are a really good idea. If you've got a lot of money and you really are worried about people doing bad stuff to your servers, they're thoroughly worth investigating. Because what they will do is they'll say, I don't care what the file permissions are, this process is not allowed to do that, and therefore I'm not going to let it do it. And the idea is that's enforced at the system level. So you can say, for example, my web server has got no need to run wget interactively. Don't let it. Great. Again, hacker trying to download tools has just found out the wget command doesn't work anymore, and the security exception gets logged somewhere. So Mac is worth doing if you've got the money. And WAFs, so web application firewalls, things like mod security, the open source ones. Mod security is great, and you can put it on there, and there's a core rule set, OWASP project for the mod security core rule set. The good thing about WAFs is they work at a slightly higher level, so they understand a bit more about your traffic. The bad thing is they will still block things, and they will get it wrong. So a good example of this, I put a WAF on my, trying to track sweat breach, I put a WAF out on my web server, and then I tried to do a blog posting, and it said, no, go away, got 500 error. Really bizarre, why do you block my blog post? And I put a cross-site scripting vector in my blog post. So the WAF said, attack, block. It can make mistakes. It doesn't really understand your application. So you have to be a bit careful with WAFs. Again, you really have to spend some time tuning it, spend some time getting it to know your application, turn off the rules that are going to cause a problem, do some profiling, but worth looking at. And all these things, and hopefully this theme is becoming fairly clear, none of these things are going to be a silver bullet. And all they're designed to do is make the attackers work harder, make them more noisy, and you will get rid of the ones who aren't really that interested. So all the low end, attackers, if there's 15 companies they can attack and they come at you, and you've got IPS, and you've got WAFs, and you've got MAC, they will, oh, I'm not doing too bad. They may move on. They move on somewhere else. And if they don't, they will leave lots of logs all over the place for you to investigate after the fact. So, crack on. Now, framework. So, application frameworks. Every application these days is built up of components, right? Everyone uses lots of libraries, they use components. The thing to do, if in a low-risk scenario, is monitor the security mailing lists that they hopefully will provide. If they don't, that's a bit of a red flag. If you're using a framework that has no means of disclosing security issues, that's a problem, because how are you going to find out when they've got one? If they think they've never had one, that's a real problem, because they're wrong. You do not want to find out from Twitter that there's a vulnerability in the framework you're using. Right? You do not want that to be your alerting mechanism. Don't let that happen. So just monitor the list. That's really straightforward. Get someone, say, right, your job is to keep an eye on security mailing lists. Register for these. Reviews. I put this one by a question mark because I've never seen it done. If you're using an open source product, and it is, an example I did this for was Ruby on Rails. If you're using Ruby on Rails and you're making lots and lots of money on it, consider doing a review of the framework, paying for it. Either doing it internally or pay for an external company to do a source code review. If you're relying on a sort of £10 million, £100 million project on a piece of open source software, consider paying for a review of it. It's probably going to be money well spent. Or get together with other companies who use the product. If there's 100 companies using the product, pay for a review. And people might be sitting there thinking, that's a really good example not to use open source software, because the vendors, the proprietary software, will do all this for you. No. Don't rely on proprietary vendors to do stuff unless you've explicitly got it from them that they do and you've seen the results. Some of the worst examples I've seen of security in web applications have been expensive vendor-supplied software. So if you can do a review, that's great. And actually, that's a bonus for open source software, because you theoretically could do a review of it. Oh, a brief aside into the cloud, which I'll be fairly brief. If you're using cloud, right, so everyone, cloud, buzzword at the moment, if you're using a cloud provider, you might have a bit of a problem with all this. Because if you're using platform as a service, you don't have any visibility over the server, over the network, over anything else. So you're going to have to rely on the vendor of the cloud to do that for you. So there's two aspects to that. One, it's kind of good because you don't have to do it, but two, you need to check and make sure they're doing it. One of the things I noticed after the Linode hack was lots of people said, that's it, I'm moving off Linode, I'm going to go and use another provider. And I was left thinking, yeah, how do you have any assurance that the next guy's any better? You don't in a lot of cases. Because most vendors won't put a lot of good information on their websites about how they do security. So if you're doing cloud at that level, you need to watch. If you're doing it like the Amazon AWS, Microsoft Azure level, you've got a lot more visibility. You can probably deploy a lot of this stuff. And actually, it's probably easier to deploy a lot of this stuff. So, but yeah, watch that. Code itself. Well, obviously I'm here in OWASP talk. I was looking at OWASP tools. There are lots of good tools you can use on your own code. Some OWASP tools, things like OWASP Zap, the useful project to go and look at. If you've not, it's a proxy tool that you can use it for analysing your application. There's also tools like Arachne, which is a black box scanner. It's a free black box scanner you can use. And obviously there are commercial alternatives as well. But this is over here in my low risk segment, so I'm going to talk about the commercial ones. But there are open source software you can use. They're not perfect. They're not going to make your application magically secure. But if what you're worried about is you're worried about the random noise of the internet, I talked about the stuff everyone faces, they use scanners. So you use scanners. So use the same tools they use, and hopefully you'll find the vulnerabilities first. And I'm really not going to talk too much about this because I'll be taking someone else's talk. App IDS. My personal opinion of the best place to put intrusion detection and intrusion prevention is in the application itself, because it's the only place where the software doing the defense can understand your application. All these other ones I've talked about, the problem they face is the fact you don't know how your app works. Well, your app knows how your app works. So doing App IDS, using something like App Sensor, is obviously the best place, to me anyway, obviously the best place to put it. So, policy. Unfortunately, policies exist. You all have to have policies. The only one I really want to talk about is for this kind of work, is incident response. So, if you're getting a sense of this talk, one of the things I'm essentially saying is the compromise, maybe not inevitable, but it's much more likely than it was, say, 5 years ago. So, have an incident response policy. Because when you have an incident, all hell will break loose. Everyone will want everything yesterday, and you want to have a policy for who do I contact? What laws do I have to comply with? Are there companies I already know about who can help me with forensics, if assuming I want to do forensics? Am I planning to get the police involved? Is a really important question to know the answer to. Because if the answer is yes, you have to get all your evidence in a very specific format. And a forensics company would be able to help you with that sort of thing. But have a policy before you have the incident. And the big boys, more incident response. Sorry, I would say, if you're a big company and this is important to you, there's a good example. There's a company called Netflix, who you've probably heard of. They do movies, online movies, and they have a thing called Chaos Monkey. Chaos Monkey's great. It goes around breaking components of theirs randomly, just during the day. So they'll just it'll say that server's broken, that load balancer's broken. So I reckon you could have something like Breach Monkey. Have someone come in, assume they've already got password perimeter, sitting on the network, and see how long it takes for people to find them, to detect them. And if the answer is never, if they get to the end of a week-long engagement and no one has said, excuse me, there's someone trying to hack our systems, then that's exactly what would happen when an attacker turned up. No one would notice. So, and if you can sit there for a whole week with no one noticing gaps, then that's not good. So practice the fact that you've got this incident response. Practice the fact that you've got to get this stuff right. And that's if you're again in the high risk category. I'm not going to suggest that's cheap, but it's worth doing. The last one, users. Passwords. I wish passwords would die. So the good example of those, if everyone's read the Verizon data breach report, which you haven't, I thoroughly recommend it. It's very good. They said in cases where there was hacking, they reckoned that if you got rid of single-factor passwords, you would knock out 80% of the breaches. Because realistically speaking, if someone's wanting to break into your system and they can get a username and password for a valid user, they will use that. They won't do a zero-day. They won't bother. Why would they? If I can log into a remote access system, username and password, I'm going to. It's a great way to attack. So at the low end, use password safes. Right? I use a password safe, and I think everyone else should too. The reason is I got about 100 passwords in my password safe, and there's no way I could remember 100 unique, strong passwords, because password reuse is a real problem. So you have to use a password safe these days. There's just too many places to remember them, in my opinion. Big boys, 2FA. Use two-factor authentication. Google did a paper recently. They reckoned by 2015, all their systems would be two-factor authentication access. So, and I agree with them, because this is the problem. They've seen the fact that the number of password-related breaches is only going up, and the only way to mitigate it is to move away from passwords as the only authentication. Again, they won't save you. I mean, I actually see this quite depressing. A lot of security people, when you talk about 2FA, they say, oh, that's not perfect. Oh, you can compromise the phone as well. Yes, you could, but it's much harder. So it's just another layer of protecting yourself, another layer to try and minimize this risk. So, how do you get money for all this? That's obviously the question that needs to be answered. None of this is free. The good way, convince the budget holders that this is important. Breach is hell. The good way to convince them that it's important, you can actually go to them and say, look, here's the risk, here's the way the risk profile is increasing, here's the fact that bugs are becoming valuable, here is obviously a trend that we need to follow. The bad way is wait for a breach. Wait till you get a breach, and you probably get more money. Again, White Hat Security did a survey of their customers, and they said that one of the best ways of improving the performance of a company was one of the ones that has a breach. So ones that already happened. And I've seen that. There's a level of focus that will come to you in a bad way and a good way if you have a breach. I would recommend having your business case ready for that incident, because it won't last. Executive management will be interested for a while, but it only lasts for a while, and then they'll move on to something else. So you want to have your business case and get the money off them right there and then. I found that when the Sony breach happened, when they had all their breaches, I was in security testing, the number of companies that suddenly started ringing up and saying, we're thinking of testing all of our internet-facing systems, which was large numbers, but it didn't last. They focused months later moved away. So the bad way, wait for a breach. And what I think is the future way, which is regulation. I love to say this wasn't true, but I'm pretty sure it is. There's no way governments are going to stand for the level of security breaches that are ongoing forever. They're going to at some point have to introduce legislation. I would guess around data protection in Europe. I think Germany already has some. I was speaking to a guy from Germany who's saying it's not good right now because some companies ignore it and therefore can get their products to market cheaper. But eventually government's going to catch up on that. And they're going to put regulation in place and it's going to mandate security. And the reason I'm really depressed about that is it's going to be a big blunt hammer. It's not going to be tailored to your company. It's not going to be tailored to your organization. It's going to be a big blunt hammer they're going to hit you with that says you will do security. And that's going to be unpleasant. But I personally don't reckon that there's a way that's going to be avoided, just because it seems inevitable. So, conclusions. Whatever. Right, so changing threat profiles are increasing risk. If you can't really read stories in the press, if you read the tech press at all, you will see stories of breaches. You only have to go for a week or two before you get another breach story. That's fairly new, and if you look at the reasons why people will be doing it, it's fairly inevitable. If you just take a purely economic argument that says more and more money on the internet, more and more people putting all their products and processes on the internet, combined with security is buggy, software is buggy, there are security bugs to be found. So there's an economic incentive and there's an opportunity. Guess what? There'll be more. I think that results in a defense in depth argument being kind of mandatory if you want to do business. Because individual controls will fail. Your software framework will have a bug. Your web server will have a bug. Someone will leave a password where they shouldn't have left a password. And someone will get unauthorized access to one of your systems. And if that is the only control that's between them and the thing that you value most, you're going to have a bad time. And lastly, yeah, it is possible to implement these controls. I said before, the problem sometimes with security is that people say, oh, that control's not perfect, so IDS isn't perfect. And you're right, IDS is not perfect. Firewalls are not perfect. Yep, firewalls are not perfect. However, I think it has to be a layered approach to it. You have to kind of build these things up. And if you do that, then you can get a situation where you'll detect an attacker, and you'll be able to kick him out before he can do serious damage. And even if you can't kick him out then, you'll be able to work out what he did and remedy it. Questions? Or stop silence. Take that. Oh, right back.
2FA need to be mandatory across the board.
I think it probably should. Well, it should be on anything you care about or anything which provides more access to anything you care about. Definitely administrative access. So anything where you're administering a system, be it VPN, be it high privileged users and Windows domains, really got to be, because those are the things that once you've got, it's a big breach. You know, if I can get past it. But weirdly, VPNs, I would say that when I started testing about 7 or 8 years ago, I almost always saw two-factor authentication, RSA tokens on VPNs. These days, I see far more internet-facing systems with just username and password. Outlook Web Access is the classic. Everyone puts their Outlook Web Access out there with username and password. But that's your domain username and password. So if I crack that, the least I can do is lock out all your accounts. And the most I can do is probably get access to someone's account who's got password one set. So yeah, I think two-factor authentication is going to be there for, or should be there for anything with high level of privileged access, definitely. And really, ideally, everyone. I mean, if you look at actually people like World of Warcraft, they can sort this out. So you give World of Warcraft, they'll give you a token, they'll say, you know, so if a game can sort it out, realize there's a risk and this is a threat profile, maybe people doing really big transactions could do the same thing.
You mentioned Google. Do you think it will be regulated by 2015 as well?
Sorry?
You mentioned Google on TFA. Do you think it will actually get regulated by 2015 as well?
I don't know. I think Google and the people at them are just providing a toolkit. I'm not sure if people would ever regulate 2FA just because it's a bit specific. The problem with regulation, one of the other problems with regulation, it tends to be very general because someone says, hang on, that's too specific, it doesn't apply to every case. So the regulation is more and more general, but becomes less useful. PCI is the only one for every, PCI is, I mentioned later on, for a lot of people hate PCI, and I agree it's not perfect, but at least it says some specific things. You know, people do this, do that, do the other, rather than just saying the general regulation thing of do good things, which is useless when you're trying to argue with someone whether to spend money on something. Yeah.
You said build the IDS into the application. Good idea. We got a project for that.
Yes, we do. App Sensor. So OWASP App Sensor is OWASP App Sensor. I think it's a brilliant idea. Essentially, it's providing like a generic framework. It's not a specific implementation. I'm not going to steal anyone's thunder from later, but the idea is it's a generic thing to say, here are places you could put a sensor, a point of saying someone's doing something bad, and here are the actions you could take. And that's a great approach, because if you think about an application, someone who says, I want user 1, user ID 1, okay, that's an ordinary user. Someone says, I want user ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Almost inevitably attacker. There's very few use cases where that's valid. And the application sees that because it gets the request. So then it's just a question of logging it and saying, hang on, that's not right. What's my action and response list for that? I think I personally think a great idea compared to IDS and WASP. Cool. Thank you very much.